All right, hello everybody. Welcome back to episode 2 in the Gen AI Getting Started series. One quick plug again, as always. If you missed prior videos or the prior posts for this, and this is the first time that you're seeing this series, go to digitalheresy.com and you'll find part 0 where we kind of talk about what large language models are, how they kind of work. There's also a post on there for part 1. And that gets into the introduction to having your first chat with Chat GPT, which we still have sort of the remnants of this here where we were asking it about rocket ships. Today, we're going to extend this a little bit, and I promise we'll get back to doing some working exercises. But before we get too far into this, we're going to take a little bit of a pause, and we're going to talk about a fancy term called prompt engineering. Now, I didn't want to use the phrase prompt engineering in the first video because I know that could be sort of intimidating. But if you followed along in the first episode and you have tried this before, or you've sat down with ChatGPT and worked on it before, or if you've spent a good amount of time on Google trying to type different things and using pluses and minuses to try to get Google to return back certain results, then congratulations, you are a certified prompt engineer. Prompt engineering is really just a fancy term for wording things in such a way in a prompt so that you can get a desired result without having to go down a bunch of rabbit holes or re-explain yourself like 50 ways. That's what prompt engineering is. It gets into more advanced topics, obviously, like we're just having conversations with AI right now and trying to ask it about things like space shuttles. You can do some pretty fancy stuff with that down the road, but I just want you to feel good about the fact that if you use this to ask it certain questions, or if you did go ahead and do the exercise, just like we did in the first episode where we went through and actually clicked on the custom instructions and started to provide the custom instructions, then that is going to be prompt engineering, essentially, because you're prompting the large language model in such a way that you're trying to get a specific kind of result back. So we have to pause here for a second, and I love this meme because this is, if you haven't seen the show, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. It's a hilarious show. One of these episodes, he goes into this rabbit hole of different conspiracy theories and things like that, right? And you'll notice that behind him, there's this giant board where it's all the different pieces of his conspiracy and how they're all kind of related together, okay? This is a little bit of what's happening underneath the hood when it comes to large language models, in the sense that since it's been trained on so much data, remember the analogy of the library or the bookstore, it's been trained on so much data that there's a lot of information going back there. And so when the large language model wants to talk to you, it can be a little intimidating, a little crazy, and kind of spit out a whole bunch of information that can be a little bit like reading from the fire hose. But we talked about those prompt engineering techniques like explain it to me like I'm 12. You can say things like try to be as concise as possible, and GPT will sort of like limit itself to not quite being so verbose. Now, in prompt engineering, there's another strategy to using less information, and that is because we have to talk about token limits. Okay. When you're dealing with a large language model and you've been talking to it for a while, you may notice something where it'll start to forget certain things from way back in the beginning of the conversation. You're going to be like, wait a minute, why is it telling me that? Or why is it acting like it hadn't talked about this before? And you might even be able to scroll back in your browser and go all the way back to previous chats. This is a little bit of a misnomer because, unfortunately, the way that the browser is designed, the browser can hold a whole lot of conversation history, but the language models themselves are a little bit limited. So we're going to talk about token limits, but I wanted to kind of show you this visual first because it gives you a pretty good idea of what we're talking about here. If you've ever been in class and you had to come up with sort of like cheat sheets or like a little crib note, and your teacher, I mean, maybe they don't do this anymore, but back in the day, some teachers would say, all right, you get to have like 1 page of notes, like for a big final or something like that, right? And so we used to practice this thing where you would write really, really tiny and try to get every little bit of information on these little cheat sheets, probably a sheet a lot smaller than this, so that if I have to refer to it, if I have to go back and try to find something specific, I have this one sheet of paper to look at. This is similar to what's happening inside of a single conversation inside of Chat GPT. See, unlike normal autocomplete where, like as you type, it kind of guesses the next word. That's kind of like simple autocomplete, right? It understands the basic structure of a sentence and knows that if you say, I want to go to, it's probably going to recommend the word the, and then recommend the word store, and it can kind of do this into infinity. Language models are a little more complicated than that, because the reason why it can carry a conversation so well is because it has to pay what's called attention to the entire context of the conversation. So even though when I type in here and I say, tell me more, right, you'll notice that this little spamming thing that you see where it's like writing out every sentence and every word, this is more than just effect. This is not just like, oh, a cute little like typewriter effect that's happening in the browser. It really is generating every single word in a sequence, depending on not just the stuff just before it, but really everything that came before it. And that's really hard to wrap your hand around, right? So when this thing says sure thing, in order to write thing, it had to also look at sure before it. It had to look at my prompt that said tell me more. And then it also has to look at the entire thing that was happening before it, right? And this kind of goes back to the cheat sheet thing, right? Our entire conversation so far has to fit on a cheat sheet. And so what it's trying to do is it's trying to look back through as much history as possible, and all of that just to generate the word thing. But it needs to know thing, and it needs to know that what's inside of my context is true, because now it's referring to me by my name. I didn't necessarily say space again in this part of it, right? So how does it know that we're going to continue to talk about space? The only way that they can do that is if it models human behavior, which is when you and I have a conversation as human beings, we also have to try to keep track of everything that's been said in the conversation. Make sense so far? Now, we're not unlike this cheat sheet here too. If you've ever had a really good conversation with a bunch of friends and it's delved on a bunch of different topics, it's not just like one thing. Like if you've covered a lot of ground, sometimes a couple hours into the conversation, you might find yourself sitting there going, man, we talked about so much. What was that thing we were talking about earlier? Your brain also has a little bit of a limited capacity in terms of the amount of things that you can talk about at once before you start to forget extra pieces of information. And just like it happens with human beings, the things that we were talking about more recently, the fresher things that are on our minds, that tends to stay in memory a little bit longer than the older stuff that we might have talked about much earlier in the conversation or even on a previous day. Same thing with large language models. So what happens is as you start to talk to the large language model and this thing starts to fill up with the chat history, it's going to start forgetting things, but it doesn't forget things in the middle of the conversation. It's going to start rolling things off of the beginning. Okay. Now this can be somewhat problematic because remember yesterday I was telling you the quality of the question and the way that you phrase things early on in the conversation can really make or break or steer the AI program in the right direction. Well, that's problematic, right? So if I've been talking to this thing for a long time and suddenly you're telling me that you're going to forget the first thing that I told it, well, now it can really get off track. And so there's a couple of ways to kind of deal with this. Number one is if you're having a long conversation, you can just sort of roll with it, right? If you're having a long conversation, you're covering a lot of topics, and it starts to forget things that were happening way back in the conversation, then you might just have to spend a little bit of time reminding it. Another strategy that I use, and it's a strategy that I even baked into Cogitator Prime in the way that it converses with people, is if it seems like you've been talking for a long time and you're getting pretty close to those limits, a really easy trick is to say, hey, our conversation is getting pretty long, and I'm worried about our token limit. Now, the AI program, in this case, Chat GPT, it knows that it's a bot, right? So it knows about token limits. You're not going to be using like a new phrase here. And even if you forget the word token, you can just say our conversation is beginning really long. I'm worried about it. And here's the magic phrase. Ready? Can we summarize what we've talked about so far? And this is a very powerful phrase. Can we summarize what we've talked about so far? You'll notice that the program will sit there and create a Cliff's Notes of the different topics that we talked about. And now this does two things. Number one, it also reminds us as humans what we've talked about so far. And you can kind of come through here and gauge, right? So this thing is talking about how rockets have to go up and sideways to go to space and all this other stuff, right? Not only is it a pretty good refresher for us, but if you notice, I just kind of gamed the system. If I'm going to forget older pieces of conversation way at the beginning, then by asking the chat program to summarize, I've essentially taken a whole bunch of old information and I've moved it to the end of the line. I've made it fresh, you see? And so now I can continue this conversation, and as long as this summary is pretty good, you could almost completely forget everything else that was happening up in previous conversations. Because if the summary is good enough, just like in real life, right? When we take notes on a call or when we take notes after a meeting, if the summary notes are pretty good, then the specifics of what was discussed before it are a little less important. So this is a magic prompt to use right here. Can we summarize what we talked about so far so that you can continue the conversation into the future? And the worst that'll happen is you'll trade off a little bit as far as like specifics and detail. And honestly, this is only because OpenAI has to sort of keep these browser sessions somewhat short, right? There's no vector database happening in the background to permanently store these conversations into infinity. That's what folks like myself do when we develop our own chatbots that have backends that can support a longer conversation. But even still, it's a good idea to summarize sometimes, keeps the conversation flowing. It's a good trick for you if it seems like you run into situations where you talk with this thing for a very long time and it seems to be forgetting. Okay? So now, what exactly are tokens, though, right? So so far I've been speaking in very human terms as far as like words that fit on a page, but let's look at tokens really quick. And I'll have this link in the description, but OpenAI themselves, so you'll recall that when you go to OpenAI, you can log in and you can either come to this chat screen, or if you signed up for it, you can also go to an area that is like your profile. And it also has a help section, right? And in this help section, if you look up tokens, there's a page like this that says, what are tokens and how do I count them? Okay. Now, a lot of people want to equate tokens as like words, sort of, yes or no, right? We're going to break it down as simple as possible. Different language models view language a little slightly differently between them. And so for OpenAI, since we are dealing with Chat GPT, they're very explicit in the way that they say one token is roughly 4 characters in English. 100 tokens is roughly 75 words, right? Couple sentences, 30 tokens. And this is just sort of rule of thumb stuff, right? And it depends on several things, because it's not just words, it's also things like punctuation. And so the reason why I brought this page up is got this really cool little visual down here where you can see how it breaks up a sentence like, my favorite color is red. So there might be tokens that represent individual words, and this is probably like overstating like favorite. If one token is 4 letters, then favorite actually might be closer to 2 tokens. But you'll notice that it also includes things like punctuation. And if you read through this article, it also talks about how punctuation and where words appear in a sentence actually also kind of matters. So if whether I use trailing spaces or whatever, right? Don't worry so much about this as insofar as just think of tokens as every time a large language model has to take words and sentences and convert them into that phrase that you've heard a lot, which is vectors or these numeric digits. That's what's happening. It has to tokenize or convert the English language words or whatever language you're speaking to it into a set of numbers, and that's where it goes off and it does all of its relevancy to figure out what the next best word is. Okay, Main takeaway here, again, not to get too technical, just tokens is how it relates things. It's less to do with like one token equals one word. Obviously, if you use bigger words, it's going to cost more tokens, and shorter words are not quite as many tokens. So why bother with that? Well, because when you get into these large language models, and remember we were talking about how long of a conversation can you have before it starts to forget, language models will advertise how many tokens they can keep track of as far as the conversation and how much it can pay attention. And here's the first place that you'll see sort of the main difference between somebody who pays for Chat GPT and gets access to GPT-4, which has a max length of 8,192 tokens in a conversation, and say Chat GPT 3.5, which is the free version, which is literally half as many tokens. There's also somewhat of a quality aspect to it, right? When we get to these large language models, remember I told you when you walk into the bookstore, the difference between like the librarian who might know a little bit about the topic that you want to talk about versus walking in and seeing like Einstein sitting there who knows a lot about it. There's a little bit of an Einstein thing going on between GPT-4 and the librarian of GPT 3.5 in terms of like the depth of the knowledge that they know. But really, if for most of the use cases that you have out there for like wanting to learn about science or asking it, how do I change a tire or bake a cake, 3.5 is going to have a well of information for 99% of the people out there, including myself, right? I only really rely on GPT-4 for sort of way more philosophical stuff and also to take advantage of larger token counts because maybe we're talking about a web page that's pretty lengthy and I don't want to have to sit there and try to chunk it out or summarize it, right? But just like we talked about before with that strategy of having it do the summary thing, all that this token limit really means is that you just have a shorter amount of time in a lengthy conversation before you have to either change the topic or start doing that summarization piece. And hopefully that makes sense. So if you are constantly going to AI and just asking it sort of like a quick 1-2 punch kind of a question, or even for something like how do rockets work, this is why these strategies of using smaller words, having GPT summarize things in smaller instances, that's why it's actually also a pretty good strategy just in general, because the more concise that you can be, the less tokens that you need. If you have to sit there and explain your question in like 3 pages of text, then you're chewing up your token count. Because remember, the other aspect that's worth pointing out here is that token count is not just how many words can ChatGPT fit into a single response. It's how many words can ChatGPT keep track of across the entire conversation, which includes the things that you say. You see? The reason why we covered that topic here, which is a little bit more advanced, is because everything else that we do from here, from a prompt engineering perspective, you just want to be cognizant of the fact that in the background, there's limitations to the length of the conversation that you can have, and that limitation is going to vary from AI to AI. So when Google released Bard was supposed to be a little more chatty, like a Google search sort of an aid. And so that one only has a limitation of, I think it was like 1,000 tokens, which is a fourth of what ChatGPT 3.5 is. On the other end of the spectrum, you may have seen posts on Digital Heresy where I'm talking to Claude 2, which is that conversational or the constitutional AI. That thing has 100,000 token limit. So you can feed it like dang near entire books and have a conversation about it without really having to repeat yourself or asking it to summarize, right? So when you explore a language model, you can either look up the documentation to see what that model has in terms of token limits. Also, you can see how current its training data is. And in a lot of cases, you can actually ask it. Let me try it in a new chat, because in a new chat in ChatGPT 4, I'm using my normal prompts. If I may, what is your current token limit? There you go. See, so ChatGPT. Oh, that's interesting. ChatGPT 4 thinks its limit is only 4,096, but it's actually 8,000. So it thinks its limit is the same one as 3.5. that's fascinating. Would not have guessed that. But you see the iteration here, right? So even though it kind of guessed that wrong probably because of the training data, you'll notice that it also alludes to what I was talking about, which is that, hey, this also includes your query and my response. So everything that we've been talking about here contributes to that token limit. Anyways, the reason why you have to point this out is because that limit is not something that even the AI really keeps track of per se. So in other words, I had to hard code it into Cogitator Prime to say, hey, we're getting to the limits of our conversation. Do you want me to reiterate things? And that's because programmatically on the back end, I actually turn the conversation into token counts and keep track myself. This is a very simple implementation, whereas where the AI doesn't necessarily keep track of that stuff, it's just happy to talk to you forever. And so you'll never see Chat GPT come back and say, by the way, I'm starting to forget stuff. I apologize. You have to sort of like notice it on your own. Okay. So again, we spent a lot of time on that, but it's kind of important because I want people to understand that before we get into more advanced topics. And also I want to empower people to know that whatever language you're using, you are absolutely going to be able to find a help page or a documentation on the same company's website, in this case OpenAI, that will give you details about that AI and sort of what its limitations are. Okay. So with the remaining time in today's lesson, I promised we would come back and do some other training on prompt engineering. So we're going to switch this back to... Let's kill this one too, and let's just do a new chat, and we're going to go GPT 3.5. I'm going to show you that you can use Chat GPT for strategy and planning. And we're going to take a simple example, not that you would do this versus just going out and just getting a recipe, but we're going to take the idea of like baking a cake, and we're going to show how Chat GPT can envision steps that you ought to take and help you plan and strategize. Okay, so baking a cake is somewhat simple. Most people know, at least hopefully know the general ingredients. But let's say that I wanted to not just bake a cake, but I also wanted to strategize on what I would need to take out of my kitchen and get it ready so that I don't have to go and grab stuff sort of one at a time. Okay. So maybe I sit down with a conversation. I say, hey, so today I want to bake a cake. But I want help in planning what I need to buy at the grocery store. And then also what kinds of cooking utensils, let's say. And I'm not going to spell that right. Utensils I might need to have on hand to bake the cake. Can you lay out a plan of attack for me? Or can you lay out a plan for me for this? Okay. So notice two things here. I asked it for two different strategies, two different concepts, right? There's the grocery list for actually having to go to the store and get stuff. And then there's also the strategy around what cooking utensils I need, right? This is useful. Hopefully you can see why it's useful, but because off of this, I can generate a list, or at least go through the list and make sure I don't forget something, right? So maybe I would have forgotten like the vanilla extract. That's probably honestly one that I would have forgotten about, right? I probably would have guessed all this stuff. You'll notice that this thing is talking about probably baking a cake from scratch, right? You'll notice that this is mentioning all of these super raw ingredients and exactly what you need, but it's also giving you definitions for why you would need that specific thing. So I didn't really even ask for that, but it's giving me that information. Now, from the cooking utensils perspective, you'll notice that it's giving us a bunch of stuff that we need here. And so maybe this also reminds me, oops, I don't have any parchment paper. But why would I need the parchment paper? Okay, so it says it's to line the cake pans and prevent sticking. Oh, that's a good idea. Okay, cool. Yeah, I should probably get that. Here it's giving you options, a whisk or an electric mixer. So if you can't afford an electric mixer, then a whisk is something that you can use instead. Okay. Now, planning and strategy, this kind of goes back to what we learned yesterday with the science rocket, right? Is if any terminology or phrasing or why this or whatever, what you don't get from a normal recipe card is if you have a question about why something, you don't necessarily get access to the person that wrote the recipe to ask them additional questions. But here, I can absolutely ask the chat, why parchment paper? How does it work? What's the purpose of the cooling rack? Why would I even bother using a cooling rack? And I can also do something really cool like this. Maybe I don't want to bake the cake from scratch. Maybe I want to be lazy and just go get like a box mix, right? But what if I'm not entirely sure exactly what comes in the box mix versus the extra stuff that I need? I might be able to guess at some of it, like vanilla or the milk, the butter, obviously, right? That's not in the box. But I can actually come in here and say, how would my shopping list change if I went with a box mix for the cake instead of raw ingredients? Pretty cool, right? So if I get the cake mix, then I know that it eliminates most of the stuff that's on this list except for the raw materials like the eggs, the vegetable oil, the milk, and the water, milk or water. And it even explains it, right? Look at this. By using the box mix, you eliminate the need for buy individual ingredients like flour, sugar, baking powder, flavorings, as all of these are already included in the mix. However, you will still need to buy a couple of things, blah, 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 right? See, this is a simple example as far as like baking a cake, but I could be sitting here having a conversation about how to change a light bulb in my house. How do I fix a flat tire if I've never had to deal with it? And what kind of tools will I need to fix a flat tire? I might be trying to strategize going to the DMV to get my license renewed, and what all do I need to bring, right? These are all things that you obviously can go out to the internet and search around and poke around and figure out. But having a conversation about it and being able to ask additional leading questions, that's the power of this. So not only can you use it to search for things and learn about science and any other topics that you have, but you can actually use Chat GPT as a personal assistant to help you strategize for accomplishing things on a day-to-day basis, right? And now, same disclaimer as anything else, right? Are these the only ingredients? Are there people out there that are probably going to say, oh, but that's not super complete? Sure, maybe. But for getting a great start into what to think about, and more importantly, the things that you might be forgetting, this is a tool that I use all the time. I ask ChatGPT for general guidance all the time because I tend to be sort of a big picture person and I forget little details like this. So this helps me out. So try that out. Let me know. Let me know if you use ChatGPT to strategize on building things. I'm trying to stay away from like digital and corporate topics and use some real life example stuff. Right. I just want to show that this thing has some practical real world examples as well, especially once you get into the fact that I can reference this information on my phone app. So ChatGPT has a phone app that you can install on your phone. I think I mentioned, and I can go to the grocery store and I can reference this stuff too. Certainly, I can also add it to Alexa and get a list going and all other stuff. But super useful. Super useful. All right, folks, that's going to wrap it up for today. Try to keep these episodes nice and short and sweet. If you want to move on to the next one, feel free. If not, thank you for staying with me. We talked about tokens. We talked about prompt engineering. Great job on becoming a prompt engineer. Sorry that we had to spend a little bit of time covering tokens, and it's kind of annoying, but that will help you save time later. examples coming up. We're even going to break out of Chat GPT 3.5. And if you've been on the fence about paying for Chat GPT 4, then I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the Pro version. And it's not that I'm selling Chat GPT. I don't work for OpenAI. I don't get any kickbacks or anything like that. But if you're starting to see where there's a value for this in your life and you're willing to spend the same amount of money as some of the different Hulu subscriptions and things like that are out there, then I want to give you a teaser video that shows you some of the more advanced features, because I think what you're really going to see is the value when we move beyond the whole text conversation thing and we start getting into images and the different plugins that are out there, just so that you're aware of them. Again, I'm not selling any of this stuff. I find it particularly useful. If you do, then I can tell you it's 100% worth it, and we're going to show you some of those features so that you can see what they're like before you buy. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for all your support, and we'll see you in the next one.